Hello, students, and welcome once again to Political Science 1513, American Federal Government. In this lecture, we are going to conclude our discussion of political intermediaries by looking at the media. And so we're going to talk about what the media is, what types of information it provides, who it influences in what ways and under what circumstances. And then we're going to conclude by talking about some of the characteristics of a story being covered by the news, which makes it uniquely useful for members of the media's sort of influence industry to exert influence on things like public opinion and therefore political outcomes. So that's the to this end, we've got 5 learning objectives that you need to focus on as you work your way through this lecture and begin taking notes. We're going to start with that first learning objective. So, number 1, you need to be able to define and distinguish between the following terms: media, mass media, and news media. Number 2, you need to be able to describe and distinguish between descriptive, interpretive, and speculative reporting. Number 3, you need to detail and distinguish between the main ways that the media influences public opinion and political outcomes, like whether a law passes or fails in Congress or which candidate wins in an election. Number 4, you need to be able to explain how persuasion works and how it is distinct from other forms of media influence like priming, framing, and agenda setting, as well as why it can be difficult and who it actually impacts. Finally, you need to be able to describe and distinguish between the 3 main characteristics that we use to compare and contrast the character of different stories being covered in the news media, and these are going to be prominence, breadth, and intensity, respectively. Let's begin at the beginning by talking about what we're going to talk about. So, what is the media and what does it do? We'll talk about how the terms media, mass media, and news media are distinct. We'll talk about the 3 types of reporting: descriptive, interpretive, and speculative. And then we're going to begin talking a little bit about the main mechanisms of media influence: priming, framing, and agenda setting, as well as a 4th, less effective, but more direct form of influence called persuasion. Let's begin at the top on the left-hand side of your screen. Here you are going to see that the term media is technically plural. This isn't how we often use it in day-to-day conversation, but technically you shouldn't say the media is or the media is not. You should say the media are or the media are not. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be a stickler on this for class purposes, but do understand that technically the singular form of the term media is a medium. So the media are, a medium is. And a medium is, very simply, a channel of communication. So anything that you can use to take information out of your head and put it into somebody else's head is, in fact, going to be a medium. And so, for example, speech is a verbal medium, which I am using right now to take information that I have and communicate that information to you. In some of your cases, perhaps I'm trying to compel you to learn this information against your will. Some of you perhaps just were already interested, and this is a unique opportunity to learn. But one way or the other, before I can take my knowledge about government and politics and turn it into your knowledge about government and politics, we need to establish communication. And so in order for us to do this, we're going to need some kind of a tool or technique, and that tool or technique is going to be a medium. If you're reading off of the screen, well, now we're using writing, which is a visual medium, just as speaking is a verbal medium. And both of these, again, are very simply tools of communication, which allow 2 or more people to communicate and share information, ideas, opinions, images, or content of some sort. But it turns out that not all media are created equal. Some forms of media are capable of reaching much larger audiences in a much more efficient manner and are therefore much more powerful if what you are interested in is exerting influence on things like public opinion and political outcomes. So within the term media, we have a subcategory. There are some types of media that fall into a subcategory called the mass media. And so as an example of this, you might consider the music industry. Now, music relies on communication just like regular spoken communication. However, there is a difference between me having a conversation with some of my colleagues in the office and, say, Nicki Minaj dropping an album at 9 a.m. And what's the big difference? Well, the difference is that there aren't going to be very many people who hear my voice when I'm communicating just with speech around a dinner table or at the water cooler. But if Nicki Minaj drops an album at 9 a.m. for some God-forsaken reason, millions of people across the world will probably have downloaded and listened to that song multiple times by 10 a.m. And so again, there's a distinction here, and it has to do with the size of the audience. So what I'd like you to understand is that a mass medium is still a medium. It is still a channel of communication, but it is distinct from other forms of media because it is, number one, capable of reaching a massive audience. Number two, over a great distance. Number three, in a very short period of time. And number four, with a single standardized message or set of contents. Again, a mass media is just a channel of communication capable of reaching a very large audience over great distances and in a very short period of time with a single standardized message. So contrast Nicki Minaj's album with a speech given by a politician. Speech, by the way, is a very powerful tool, but it's not usually considered a form of mass media. Because even with modern technologies that allow me to amplify the volume of my voice many hundreds of times over, there are some pretty stringent limits on the size of audience I can communicate with through speech alone. Even if I have concert-grade speakers, at best, I'm going to communicate with a stadium full of people. But it doesn't matter how loud I'm screaming into a microphone, there is no speech I can give which is so loud that people in New York or Beijing are going to be able to hear it while I am speaking in Durand. However, if I broadcast that same speech using television or internet or some other recording and broadcasting technology, then in that case, I have stepped into the realm of mass media. The radio is a form of mass media because it is capable of reaching people over vast distances with the same content in a very short period of time. But we need to narrow the scope even further, because usually if you're having a political discussion and you hear somebody complaining about the media or the mass media, they're really talking about a part of the mass media called the news media. So for instance, you've probably heard people arguing about, at some point in your life, you've probably heard people arguing about whether the media in our country has a liberal bias or not. And I don't need to weigh in on that here, but wherever you fall on that issue, when people say things like, well, the media is liberal, or no, the media is not liberal, they're not really talking about the music industry in general. They're not just talking about any channel of communication always having an inherent bias. No. What they're really talking about is a part of the mass media complex in our country called the news media. And a news medium is a type of mass medium, so you know that it is a channel of communication capable of reaching a very large audience over great distances in a small amount of time with a standardized message. But what separates the news media from other forms of mass media has to do with the reason that people generally consume the news media. Because you see, the news media is distinct in that it regularly conveys political information. And that's the primary reason to consume the news media. If you're just looking to be entertained, there are probably better things you can do with your time than tune into C-SPAN. If you don't know, by the way, C-SPAN basically just provides live broadcasts which allow you to see moment by moment what is going on in the United States Senate and the United States House and things of this nature. And hey, if you're just looking for straight, unfiltered information about developments on Capitol Hill, that's a great place to go. But I'll just tell you that it's going to be like watching paint dry if that is your main source of information, because most of the time what you're going to see is a bunch of old white men milling around an otherwise empty chamber. And so, as it turns out, that's not very exciting most of the time. Now, there might be exceptions. Every once in a while, a politician you like might be giving a really, really motivational speech, but by and large, there are only two reasons to watch C-SPAN. Either A, you're trying to learn about what's happening on Capitol Hill, or B, you're extremely depressed, it's 2 a.m., and you're crying into an empty carton of Ben and Jerry's ice cream. There's really no other reason. On the other hand, if we're talking about music, you're probably not listening to it because you're looking for political commentary or information about electoral results in a foreign country. The main reason you watch the news or consume news media is to learn. Whereas the main reason that you might want to listen to Nicki Minaj's "You a Stupid Hoe" is pretty straightforward. You're wanting to be entertained. It's got a sick beat and you can dance to it. It's probably not because you want to be a more informed citizen of this democracy. And so again, you can see a pretty distinct difference between music and the news media. Now, don't get this wrong. Just as a politician might occasionally do something entertaining on C-SPAN, music does occasionally contain and come with political messaging, right? If you listen to Alice in Chains' Rooster, that's a commentary about the Vietnam War, right? There are many songs that you've probably heard, which you didn't necessarily realize at first were deeply political. And then all of a sudden you start paying attention to the lyrics and you say, oh, that's what this song is about. But again, you didn't come upon that song. You're not listening to that song most of the time for the message. The message is secondary. The main purpose is entertainment. So what is the difference between a news medium like, say, CNN, Fox News, Breitbart, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, or something of that nature on the one hand, and general mass media on the other hand? The difference is that news media regularly conveys political information. Whether it's good or bad information is a different question, but it regularly conveys political information, and it is primarily consumed for the purposes of gathering that information. And again, in day-to-day conversation, we often use the term media when what we're really talking about is news media. And in fact, I myself might fall into that habit during the course of this lecture. So right now, I'd like you to just go ahead and make a note. From here forward, what we're really talking about when I say media is a specific part of the media called the news media, a form of mass medium distinguished from other mass media by the fact that it regularly conveys and is primarily consumed for political information. So that's the left-hand side and really the first learning objective, but our second learning objective asks for you to describe and explain the difference between the three main types of reporting that the news media engages in. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. And we're going to start at the top of the right-hand side of your screen, and we're going to work our way down. So we will begin with descriptive reporting. Descriptive reporting might be defined as a journalistic approach to the news, in which reporters provide a straightforward description of facts. In other words, they're just going to tell you what happened or what is happening, where it's happening, and who it's affecting, or at what time this is transpiring. So, for example, you probably already know that a couple of years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. And I'm willing to bet that most of you didn't learn about this through word of mouth. Now, to be clear, that is one way that information might travel. The news media is not the only way that we get our information about facts and developments with regards to politics, elections, wars, so on and so forth around the world or in our country and community. But it is, you should note, the main and therefore the most influential way that we gather our information about these types of facts. And that's deeply important because, as it turns out, if the media, the news media, is our main source for information about politics, well, then it has a great deal of power to shape how we feel about politics. Things like what sorts of issues or topics or developments we are taking into consideration when we form opinions or make decisions about who to vote for, where to stand on an issue, or what political party to support. And again, most of us are going to get that information from the media. The media is not perfect. The news media sometimes gets it wrong. And sometimes it's a little slow to take up on a story that probably warrants a lot of very rapid coverage. But by and large, it is the worst possible option except all the others. If you're trying to learn through word of mouth alone, again, eventually you'll probably have figured out there's a war in Ukraine. But it's going to take a while for word to travel across the Atlantic Ocean. And in addition to that, by the time that these rumors of war have been filtered through a few thousand people on their way from Ukraine to Durant, Oklahoma, or wherever you happen to be sitting right now, they're going to have probably been warped a little bit by misunderstandings, miscommunication, or outright lies. And so again, the news media is not the only place to get these facts about what's happening around the world, but it is probably the most accurate and efficient way for most of us, since most of us don't have the ability to just fly over to Ukraine and see what's going on for ourselves. And again, that means that the media has a really important role to play in providing us with basic facts about what's happening, where it's happening, and when it's happening to who. Which again means that it has a great deal of influence. But at this stage, we haven't really gotten into anything that's deeply controversial or potentially problematic. This begins to change as we work our way down the slide and start talking about what is called interpretive reporting. Interpretive reporting is a journalistic approach to the news in which reporters help to contextualize and explain why an event has occurred or is taking place. And very frequently, the way that they're going to go about helping to explain why an event is happening or what context it is happening within is by connecting that story to other developments that they have also talked about or that you might not be aware of. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's stick for now with our Ukraine crisis example. Now, if you live in Russia and you're watching the news, you're probably going to get a lot of the same descriptive facts that people in the United States or in Western Europe have gotten from their news. There is a war. It is between Russia and Ukraine. But you're going to start to see some pretty stark differences when we get into interpreting those facts, making sense of and contextualizing those facts. So if you're watching the news coverage of the war in Ukraine right now in the United States, then probably your impression is that this war has been started by Vladimir Putin, who is the premier political figure in Russia, but also a sociopathic megalomaniac imperialist who just wants to expand his domain and his sphere of influence. Now, that might be true. I'm not saying that this interpretation of events is wrong. But if it is true, then that has some important implications for how we, the American people, who have to choose political leaders, ought to be voting. Because it has implications for the most likely and appropriate way to solve the problem. If the problem is just caused by the raw paranoia and megalomania of Vladimir Putin, then perhaps the best thing that we can do is take a very hard stand against Vladimir Putin. And maybe if the opportunity presents itself, we actually need to take the guy out. But if you're watching the coverage of the war in Ukraine from your house in Moscow, then you're going to get a very different interpretation. In this case, probably your impression is that Vladimir Putin is defending your country from NATO or really US-led Western imperialism. And you're probably going to hear a lot of stories about how Western countries like the United States have been working very hard to encourage Ukraine to join a Western military alliance originally formed to oppose the Soviet Union, what today you would think of as Russia, but also Ukraine and some other parts of Eastern Europe. And that would be very, very bad for Russia. You might also be hearing some stories about how there are Nazi factions and terror cells in parts of Ukraine targeting Russian citizens and people who are ethnically Russian or who speak Russian and have Russian culture and background. And so for you, what has led to this event might not be Vladimir Putin's megalomania, and therefore the solution is not to take out Vladimir Putin. On the contrary, the underlying issue which has caused this crisis is not Putin. He is the solution. Instead, the problem is Western imperialism. And so perhaps the best thing to do in those circumstances is for the United States to stop trying to get involved in Eastern Europe. Or perhaps you think that the problem has less to do with Western imperialism and more to do with neo-Nazi factions in Ukraine. Well, if that's what's caused this crisis, then the solution might be just to go into Ukraine and take out the neo-Nazi terror cells. Again, these are very, very different outcomes. And which one makes the most sense as a policy proposal depends to a great extent on your understanding of what caused the event. And so what that means is that we, people who don't necessarily have access to all the information necessary to figure out why an event has taken place once it has taken place, are going to rely on the media to do more than just give us a straightforward depiction of the facts. We also want them to help us interpret the facts and understand how different stories are going to relate to one another. So perhaps another example of this can come from the 2015 terror attacks in Paris, France. Most of you probably remember, or at least you have parents and friends and relationships who remember that, yes, in 2015, there was a terror attack which involved an organization called ISIS opening fire at a concert in Paris, France. Now, here's what's interesting. When this happened, the media immediately picked up on it and began by giving us some descriptive facts. There are men, they're dressed in a certain way, they're saying certain things, and they have opened fire. This many people have been affected that we know of. We're still gathering information, but here is a basic breakdown of what has happened so far. They did not stop there, however. They went on to begin talking about how we got to this place. And so they identified the perpetrators as an organization called ISIS, which might raise some questions for you because you may know that ISIS, although it has since been mostly obliterated, was primarily at that time based in Iraq and Syria. And so you might ask, well, how do we go from Iraq and Syria to Paris, France? There's a lot of distance between Iraq on the one hand, Paris on the other hand. And you might also be asking, like, what does ISIS even care about Paris? Well, it turns out that the reason that ISIS decided to perpetrate this attack had to do with the fact that it was very strongly opposed to the Western world's policy in the Middle East, and in particular with regards to Israel and Palestine. And so they wanted to send a message that Western audiences would hear. It also turns out that there were some individuals within the intelligence agency for the French government that were kind of in dereliction of their duty. They had the information necessary to stop this terror attack, but they failed. And so what happened? Well, it turns out that the event in Paris is related first to a separate set of stories pertaining to conflicts between Israel and its Arab-Palestinian neighbors. It also turns out that what happened in Paris is connected to developments in Iraq. The United States had previously withdrawn from Iraq and Afghanistan, leaving the recently disbanded Iraqi military, a bunch of unemployed young men whose only marketable skill was killing, armed and now equipped with abandoned U.S. military devices, Humvees, so on and so forth, to take over their country. And then that organization, offended by what was happening in Israel and Palestine, decided to take the fight to the Western world. There therefore was a complex constellation of interrelated stories that might at first glance seem unrelated, that actually turn out to have worked together to help to explain what happened in Paris, France. And again, the only reason that we really know all of this is because the media told us. The media began investigating and helping us to contextualize so that we understand not just what happened, but why and how it happened. Finally, we're going to talk about speculative reporting. Now, speculative reporting, just like interpretive reporting, can be controversial. Interpretive reporting, remember, is controversial in part because the interpretations that the media offers explaining why events happen, first off, are quite subjective. And second off, play a very big role in shaping things like how we respond to various issues. Meaning that there might be some incentives for people within the media and its influence industry to favor interpretations of events that lead to certain policy proposals which are beneficial for them or their political allies. All of that is potentially problematic. But it turns out that we also expect the media not just to tell us what happened, descriptive reporting, explain why it happened and how it's connected to other events, interpretive reporting, but also to make predictions about the likely significance and future consequences of an event. And here again, we're going into a realm of subjective journalism, because it turns out that most reporters don't have a crystal ball which allows them to see the future. It turns out that reporters are just ordinary people like you and me. And very often, they're being asked to make predictions that no one can possibly make with any reasonable degree of certainty, much less a journalist who doesn't necessarily have expertise in the field that they're being asked to talk about. So, for example, we very frequently expect journalists to make predictions about the likely consequences of tariffs or changes in economic policy. But most journalists have a degree in journalism, not in economics. And so they don't necessarily have the expertise to make those predictions accurately. Now, sometimes they get things right. For example, after the terror attacks in Paris, France, the media predicted that France would probably step up its involvement in the formerly US-led campaign against ISIS, playing a much bigger role. And lo and behold, that is exactly what happened. Prior to these events, France was basically staying out of it. After these events, France became a very important part, and for a moment, the leading contributor to the otherwise US-led coalition to destroy ISIS. And so, again, they can get things right, and so that can be helpful, because these types of stories have consequences for us, and we want to know what they are. But speculative reporting can also be problematic because, again, it's deeply subjective. Different reporters can come up with different predictions or different ideas about what is or is not likely to impact you in your daily life. And more importantly, they can just plain get it wrong. And when they get it wrong, this is often deeply destructive. Sometimes their predictions can be self-defeating or self-fulfilling prophecies. So here's an example of where speculative reporting might go wrong. The weatherman predicts, based on what they are observing on the radar, that there are going to be sunny skies today. So you, a person who has listened to the news and trusted its expertise, leave your car windows open. And then it rains. And now you have wet seats. When the media makes a prediction, people have a tendency to adjust their behavior, expecting that prediction to come true. And then if it doesn't, this can be problematic. Or we might consider a situation in which, because the media predicts an outcome, something else happens. Here's one possible example of that. During the 2016 election, then presidential candidate Donald Trump was running for office when a recording of him having made some rather offensive jokes about sexually assaulting women was leaked to the media. Now, I do want to be fair. He was clearly joking in the video. But I also want to be clear, what he was joking about was sexual assault. And so whether it was a joke or not, this is not a good look for a dude who's trying to get people to vote for him in a country where a majority of voters are women. And therefore, the media picked up on the story. Now, first, they just gave us a description of the facts. There was a leaked recording of Donald Trump from a time before he was running for president, and here's what he said. Now, I'm not going to repeat the language here because it's quite vulgar, and frankly, I don't want that recorded. But the point is that after they gave us the facts, people took an interest because they understood immediately and intuitively that this had the possible consequence of changing the outcome of the election. It had the potential to make a very big difference in whether Trump would win or lose. And so the media began analyzing it. And here's what they predicted by and large. Donald Trump had defeated himself. He had sunk his own ship. He had shot himself in the foot because women are not going to vote for a man after he has been seen having made these comments. At least that's what we were told. But it turns out that they were mistaken because Donald Trump actually won the 2016 presidential election. And although he didn't win the female vote, he actually did pretty well by Republican standards. Great. But he didn't lose the female vote by a significantly larger margin than your typical Republican candidate. And indeed, there are certain demographics of women that actually voted for him more than alternative candidates. So, for example, white women, they voted for Donald Trump. And this is how we got the first pumpkin spice president. And so you see, when they made this prediction, they had basically told a bunch of people around the country that Donald Trump was no longer a viable candidate. And what that might mean, it's hard to verify this, but what that might mean is that lots of people who would have shown up to vote for Hillary Clinton, or at least to vote against Donald Trump, decided to stay home. And they decided to stay home because they didn't think that their vote was necessary. They said, hey, look, the dude's already lost. The media's already predicted that because of these comments he made, he can't possibly win. Why should I bother showing up to vote for him? It's a foregone conclusion. And then it turns out that no. The very act of having said that he lost became a self-defeating prophecy. People who would have voted against him, leading to his defeat, instead stayed home, leading to his victory. And so those are the three types of reporting, and why interpretive and speculative reporting, at least, can be deeply controversial, but why all three types of reporting are deeply important and influential. Our next learning objective asks for you to describe the primary ways in which the media exerts influence on things like political outcomes or public opinion. And it turns out that the media does exert influence, whether it wants to or not. Now, probably most people in the media enjoy having the ability to do things like sway who Americans vote for or where they stand on issues. But even if they were completely robotic, mechanical regurgitators of information, one thing you have to keep in mind is that the media does not have an infinite supply of anything. It does not have unlimited resources. And that means that it's going to have to make some decisions. Since it does not have limitless resources, the media cannot cover all of the stories in every possible way all of the time. And instead, it's going to have to make important decisions. Important decisions about what gets covered, how it gets covered, how much or how often it gets covered, when it gets covered, or where it gets covered. If you are the New York Times, for example, you're going to have to decide which stories wind up on the first page and which ones wind up on the last page. On the other hand, if you are Fox or MSNBC or some other cable broadcast news program, you're going to have to decide which stories you're covering during prime time and which stories are relegated to the 2 a.m. time slot where your viewership is extremely low. And if you decide to put a story on the first page of your newspaper, well, that's going to mean that a lot more people will see the headline, but it also means that you're going to insinuate through this decision that for whatever reason, this story is more important than whatever comes next. If I ask you, hey, pick up a newspaper and tell me what is the most important story of the day, you're not going to turn to page 6 or 32 or 10. You're going to go and you're going to look at the front page. And if the media decides that it's going to cover a topic like, let's say, gun control or tariffs right before an election, well, that's going to insinuate that tariffs are an important issue in this election, that you should be making decisions about things like who to vote for based, at least in part, on your opinions about tariffs. So what's the long-winded point I'm trying to build up towards? Well, put shortly, the fact that the media has to make decisions about what gets covered, how or how often or how much, when and where, means that it is inevitably going to exert influence, and there are three primary ways that it's going to go about doing so. And the three primary ways that the media exerts influence are through what we call priming, framing, and agenda setting. There is a fourth mechanism of media influence that we will talk about momentarily called persuasion, but for now just note that persuasion is not one of the major methods of media influence when it comes to talking about things like public opinion or political outcomes. And the simple reason why we're going to exclude persuasion from the list of major methods of media influence is that although persuasion can sometimes work, it is usually not very effective. And we're going to talk about why, but again, it is not one of the major methods of media influence. It's really quite secondary. The three major methods are priming, framing, and agenda setting. They are listed on the left-hand side of your screen, and we're going to go through each of these one by one. Let's start at the top with priming. Priming is a method of influence in which the media or another actor affects what factors, stories, issues, or criteria you take into consideration while evaluating a candidate or an event, while making a judgment, while forming an opinion, or making a decision like who to vote for, which party to support, or where to stand on an issue. Again, priming is just a method of influence in which the influencer affects what factors or criteria somebody takes into consideration while forming an opinion, making an evaluation, or coming to a conclusion. And so here's an example of what priming might look like in your personal life. If you are walking out the door and you say, hey, I'm on my way to the grocery store, someone else in the room might say something like, hey, don't forget, we need milk. In that case, they're priming you to take into consideration the fact that there is no milk in your refrigerator when you are making a decision about what to take off of the shelf at the grocery store. Now, they're not necessarily trying to make an argument explaining to you why you should buy milk. They're just saying, hey, when you are making that decision, consider this. They may not personally care whether you have milk. Maybe that person is lactose intolerant and won't actually be drinking the milk. But they think it is a factor that is important enough to remind you of it right before you walk out the door and head to the grocery store. And the fact that they have primed you to take into consideration the fact that there is no milk in your refrigerator will probably make it more likely that you remember that lack of milk when you're deciding on whether to pick up milk or not. And if when you are making this decision, you're thinking about the fact that you don't have milk, well, it is true to say that you're more likely to pick up milk than you might have been had you not been reminded. And the same type of thing can apply in the context of politics. People make decisions about who to vote for or against based on issues that they are going to have strong feelings about. But in most elections, we don't necessarily take every single opinion on any political issue that we might have into consideration for every single candidate. Instead, we tend to narrow the scope, and we're going to decide who to vote for or against based on 2 or 3 issues that we think are particularly important or that we feel are at stake in a particular competition or campaign for office. And how do we decide what issues are at stake in, say, a presidential election? Well, we make this determination, at least in part, based on the media. Again, if the media is spending a lot of time talking about COVID-19, the Ukrainian crisis, what's happening in Israel and Palestine, or tariffs and trade wars, then what it's going to be doing by covering these during an election is telling you that that is what is at stake in this election. So when you are in the voting booth and you're deciding who to vote for, you should do so at least based in part on which candidate shares your opinions with regards to those particular issues. Take into consideration that Donald Trump supports this tariff or opposes that tariff. Take into consideration while forming an opinion about which party to support that the Republican Party holds this position on abortion, while the Democrat Party holds that position on abortion. And again, this is not quite the same thing as making a direct appeal. Support Democrats because. Vote Donald Trump because. Instead, it's just saying while you are forming your opinion or making your decision about where to stand, which party to support, or who to vote for, take these issues, take these stories, take these developments into consideration. So that's priming. Again, a method of media influence in which the media can shape things like public opinion or political outcomes by shaping what factors people take into consideration while forming opinions or making decisions about how to behave or how to engage the political process. But it's not just priming. We also have framing. And framing is a related method of media influence in which the media affects how we think about an issue or how we understand and interpret the actions of political leaders or an event. And so, for example, if I were to ask a pro-life person to define the term abortion, a pro-life person might say that an abortion is an operation to terminate the life of an unborn child. If I were to ask the exact same question of a pro-choice person, The pro-choice person might say that an abortion is an operation to terminate a probably unwanted pregnancy. These are both true in their own way, but they are frames which limit the scope to one particular aspect of the issue. And that's one way of me trying to explain to you that while the media does definitely use frames, right, it emphasizes certain aspects of the stories and events it's talking about, this doesn't necessarily have to be a conscious endeavor. We all have a tendency to frame issues based on our priorities, our wants, our needs, our expectations, and our biases. And the media is not an exception. But see, here's the thing. If when you're making a decision about where to stand on abortion, what you're thinking about are the rights of the unborn child, that might tilt you, that might predispose you to fall in favor of generally restricting abortion, the pro-life side. On the other hand, if what you're thinking about is the woman's right to make decisions about her own body and pregnancy status, that might predispose you towards the pro-choice side of the issue. Or similarly, if you're thinking about the current crisis in Ukraine in terms of Western imperialism, and if what you're focusing on is our historical legacy of interventionism in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and how poorly those operations happened to turn out, then you might not be all that inclined to support a president who wants to renew, increase, or simply continue providing military assistance to Ukrainian resistance forces. On the other hand, if what you're thinking about is Russian imperialism, and if you're considering things like the problems that occurred when Western European powers decided to compromise with Adolf Hitler under the leadership of Neville Chamberlain, and if what you're thinking about is the Soviet Union, when you're trying to decide how to feel about what's happening in Ukraine, that might lead you to a totally different conclusion. So, in other words, framing is to some extent inevitable, because anytime you talk about something, you're going to have to talk about it in a particular way. But it's also deeply influential, because it turns out that how you talk about an issue, what aspects of a topic you emphasize, will dramatically influence how people respond to or feel about that particular issue. Finally, we have agenda setting. If priming tells you what to think about while forming an opinion, and framing tells you how to think about it, well, then agenda setting tells you how much to care about it. Agenda setting might be defined as a method of influence in which the media shapes how important we perceive an event or story to be, how much we care about it, or how much weight we attach to it while making our decisions about things like who to vote for, or where to stand on an issue, or which party to support. So as an example of this, we can go back to the scandal that rocked the Trump campaign way back in the year 2016 BC before COVID. See, in 2016, remember, Donald Trump had made some comments that were leaked to the media where he basically joked about sexually assaulting women. And it turns out that different media outlets talked about that story in very different ways. See, if you were to get your news from Fox, then you might walk away with the impression that, yeah, this dude told an offensive joke. He has a dark sense of humor. But should I really be deciding who I'm voting for to be the next president of the United States based off a joke, a tasteless joke? No. Listen, he made the joke. He probably shouldn't have made the joke. But are we really going to decide who to vote for based off of this offhand comment? Or are we going to decide who to vote for based on the bigger issues facing our country, like ISIS or immigration? So for Fox, this is not an issue so important that it deserves a place on the agenda when we as a country come together and meet at the election booth to decide who we're going to vote for. But on the other hand, if you were watching the coverage of that exact same story, that exact same development on CNN or MSNBC or another left-leaning media outlet or another anti-Trump media outlet, you would have gotten a very, very different picture. See, for them, this wasn't just locker room talk. This wasn't just someone telling a tasteless joke. This was a man running for president betraying in a moment of accidental candor his inner character, his thoughts, feelings, and disposition towards women. And so for them, it did deserve a place on the agenda. It was something that you should be talking about and considering and taking into consideration while deciding whether you can vote for this guy or not, because now it is actually a referendum on whether that is acceptable. If you're willing to vote for someone after they've said something like that, what does it say about your views towards women? What does it say about our country's views towards women? And so again, what they're really doing is they're having a fight about what issues are important enough to warrant a place on the public's agenda during our electoral meeting. And again, I'm using this metaphor intentionally because this is actually where we come up with the term agenda setting. Look, imagine that you are invited to a meeting, or you're sent to a meeting by your supervisor at work, and they hand you an agenda. What's on that agenda? A list of issues that you need to talk about. But what if all of those issues are very trivial topics that could have better been addressed by an email? I mean, I think we've all been to a meeting that should have been an email, and it's extremely irritating. We don't want to have our time wasted being drawn in to talk about every single issue that might emerge anywhere in our office. If we're all going to take the time out of our day to get together and discuss something, it better be important. But there is room to argue about what decisions are important and what decisions are trivial. What issues or topics warrant the public's consideration, warrant a place on the agenda. Abortion, probably yes. Donald Trump's tasteless jokes about sexually assaulting women, big fat question mark. I don't know, but the media is going to help us figure that out. Because the presumption for many of us is that if it's not being picked up on by the media, it's probably not that important. If it were a big deal, the media would be talking about it. So the media sets the agenda. It tells us what issues we're going to think about, how much we're going to care about those issues, and how we're going to think about those issues. And all of these have the ability to indirectly shape things like public opinion and therefore political outcomes, who we vote for, and therefore who wins or loses in an election. But as it turns out, while priming, framing, and agenda setting are the three main mechanisms of media influence, they're not the primary mechanisms. There is another way in which the media can, under certain circumstances, exert influence. And it's going to do so through a fourth mechanism called persuasion. Persuasion is a method of media influence in which the media attempts to directly shape or change public opinion or political decisions by making arguments or presenting persuasive materials that change who you support or where you stand. Okay, so I want you to note that persuasion is distinct from the three main methods of media influence in at least two important ways. First, it is way more direct and therefore substantially more obvious. That's the first difference. It is more direct and obvious. And those things are actually, it turns out, deeply important. But just to sort of drive home the distinction, let's compare persuasion to priming. If I wanted to prime you, I might say, hey, when you go and you're deciding who to vote for to be the next president of the United States or the next congressman for Oklahoma's 2nd Congressional District, think about this. Taxes. Consider the issue of abortion. And if I've done that, then you're more likely to take into consideration the topic of taxes or the issue of abortion while deciding who to vote for. You're more likely to decide to vote for or against somebody based on whether you agree with them over the issue of abortion than you might have been if I hadn't brought up the issue in the first place. But I don't necessarily know where you stand on that issue, and therefore I don't know whether this is going to make you more or less likely to support my candidate. So I'm not telling you who to vote for, but I am telling you what to vote on. You should vote, at least in part, based on the topic of abortion. Whereas in persuasion, I'm not just going to say, hey, when you're deciding who to vote for, take these topics into consideration. I'm going to say, hey, vote for Bob, or vote for Sue, or don't vote for Bob. Vote against Sue, and then I'm going to explain why I want you to do so. And now my argument might still relate to abortion. Bob is pro-life, or Sue is pro-life. Bob is pro-choice, or Sue is pro-choice. And that's good or bad because X, Y, or Z. But here's the issue that you're going to start to run into.
The moment somebody is explicitly telling you who to vote for, where to stand, or what party to support, in other words, the moment that the media is trying to exert influence through persuasion, it has betrayed its own agenda. This is really obvious, and that leads us to the second point. Persuasion is not just, number one, more direct and obvious, it's number two, less effective. And these things, again, are not unrelated. Persuasion is, in fact, a generally ineffective method of media influence precisely because it's so obvious. See, here's the thing. Once somebody has exposed their biases and agenda by making an argument, say, for or against a particular candidate, then you know what they're trying to get you to do. And you can discount their arguments or become suspicious of their information because you know that they now have an agenda that they're pushing. They have a reason, a motive to mislead you. And so think about, for example, a used car salesman. Now, if you walk onto a used car lot and the salesman approaches you and he starts trying to really convince you to purchase a particular vehicle, you're probably going to become suspicious because you know that that salesman has a reason to try to get you to buy the worst vehicle at the highest possible rates, so that he can get the bad vehicles off of his lot as quickly as possible, making as much money as possible in the process, and then clear up space for a better vehicle. He doesn't necessarily want to sell his best vehicles first. He wants to get rid of the junkers. And so you're going to be deeply suspicious of him when he starts telling you that this car has never had any mechanical problems, and it was just a weird coincidence that it's wound up on his lot. You might start to think that he's trying to mislead you and become suspicious and not take him seriously when he starts telling you what a great vehicle it is. And the same thing is true if, say, you're a Democrat and a Republican is telling you to vote for their candidate. The fact that they are a Republican trying to convince you to vote for a Republican might lead you to think that maybe they're not being completely honest because you know they have an incentive to mislead you. Or similarly, if you are a Republican and a Democrat starts trying to convince you to vote for someone like Kamala Harris, well, you know that Kamala Harris is a Democrat, you know that this other person is a Democrat, and so you know that they have a built-in reason to be biased in Kamala Harris's favor. And so this leads us to the first of two major reasons why persuasion, being direct and obvious, is also, in general, deeply ineffective. It has to do with what we call the partisan credibility conjecture, the PCC, or sometimes the partisan credibility thesis, the PCT. Now, whether you're calling it a conjecture or a thesis, it doesn't matter. The partisan credibility conjecture basically tells us that people tend to trust information which comes from people who share their political or partisan biases, identities, and affiliations more than they trust information which comes from those who do not. In other words, it turns out that one reason persuasion is hard is that the people you want to persuade tend to be suspicious of the arguments you present. Republicans are suspicious of arguments and information presented by Democrats and Democratic sources. Democrats are suspicious of arguments and information presented by Republicans and Republican sources. And so what this means is that even if you can establish communication with the other side as a media outlet, you're going to have trouble convincing them to change their mind on an issue once their mind's made up. It is very, very difficult to get someone who has, say, decided that they love Donald Trump and believe he's the best president in American history to then say, well, maybe he's not so great. Or conversely, if someone has already decided that they just hate Trump, good luck convincing them to change their mind. Once somebody has made up their own opinion on an issue, a topic, or a candidate, they're going to be deeply, deeply suspicious of any arguments, any information, or any stories that depict that candidate or that issue in a light that is inconsistent with their prior notions. And when this does happen, they're going to dismiss it as just propaganda, just bias. So that's how most of us consume the news. If I agree with it, that's good news. If I disagree with it, that's fake news. And that's an unfortunate reality, but it is a reality. And it is one reason why persuasion doesn't usually work, because it's too direct and obvious. Once you try to persuade me to vote for Bob, I know that you're a Bob supporter, and I'm going to be suspicious of all the information that you present, which makes Bob look good or his opponent look bad. Fake news. But all of that presumes that the media is able to establish communication, and this is not necessarily true. As it turns out, just reaching the other side of the aisle is itself very difficult because of what we call high informational efficiency. Now, if you don't know, informational efficiency is just the degree of control over the media content to which you are exposed that you happen to have. In other words, if you live in an environment with high informational efficiency, you have a great degree of control over the information you are exposed to or the media content you consume. And in the United States, that is true. We have a high degree of informational efficiency. And that, in turn, means that we have the ability to filter out information we do not like or do not trust, and only consume information that is consistent with our prior expectations and values. Listen, as I have already told you, the main reason why people consume content from the news media is because they want to learn about politics. They're looking for information. I have also told you, as per the partisan credibility conjecture, that we tend to be suspicious of information which is not consistent with our prior political biases. So again, Republicans trust information that comes from Republicans and makes Republicans look good. Democrats trust information that comes from Democrats and makes Democrats look good. But we are distrustful of the other side's arguments and information. And therefore, we're not going to consume that information because we don't think that it's accurate. And remember, the whole purpose of listening to the news is to learn. So, putting these together, what we're going to find is that when you have high informational efficiency, people tend to segment out into distinct audiences. Audiences are said to be segmented when they are separated into small groups with very little overlap. So, for instance, you probably know one or two probably older individuals who are hardcore Republicans and get all of their news from Fox. You might also know some individuals who are probably very liberal and get all of their news from MSNBC. And I'm not criticizing either side, but what I am going to say is that you probably don't know a lot of people who spend an equal amount of time consuming information presented by Fox and MSNBC. Our audiences are segmented. They're not overlapping. There are not many people who watch both Fox and MSNBC, although there are a lot of people who watch one or the other. And what this means is that if you're MSNBC and you want to convince someone that Donald Trump is the Antichrist, or if you're MSNBC and you want to convince somebody that the Democratic Party is the greatest party in the history of humanity, well, you're going to have trouble doing so because the only people who actually watch MSNBC or CNN already believe that Donald Trump is the Antichrist, so you can't persuade them to think this. They already support the Democratic Party, so you can't persuade them to support the Democratic Party. Similarly, conservative-leaning media outlets like the Daily Wire, Breitbart, or Fox News might want to persuade you to support Republican candidates, but if you are the sort of person who reads the Daily Wire or who watches Fox News, you're probably going to do that anyway. And so whether we're talking about conservatives or liberals, they wind up preaching to the choir. And that means, again, persuasion is very difficult. But do not misinterpret what I'm trying to tell you. Because what I've said is that persuasion is not usually effective, and it is generally quite difficult. It's not generally a good way for the media to exert influence on things like public opinion and political outcomes, but there are exceptions. There are certain circumstances in which the media's persuasive arguments and messaging can actually be deeply effective. In order for the media to use persuasion effectively, it's going to have to reach what we sometimes refer to as floating voters. And by a floating voter, what I really mean here is an individual who has not yet formed any strong political opinions, attachments, ideas, values, or positions. So this is not yet a person who identifies as a Republican or thinks of themselves as a Democrat, at least not in any serious or concrete way. This is not somebody who is radically pro-life or extremely pro-choice. This is not a far left or far right wing conservative or liberal. This is somebody who does not have any strong opinions, who has not chosen a side in this so-called culture war that we are supposedly experiencing in the United States. But rather somebody who probably isn't all that interested in government and politics, doesn't pay much attention to the news because they're not interested in government and politics, and therefore has not yet formed any strong opinions whatsoever. And if somebody has not formed any strong opinions about which candidate they're going to vote for, then none of these problems with persuasion that we've been talking about apply. Look, if you don't have any strong opinions, then you can't filter out information which challenges those opinions. Similarly, if you haven't picked a political party, the partisan credibility conjecture doesn't apply. If you're neither a Republican or a Democrat, then it doesn't make sense to say that you're going to distrust the other side's information. You haven't picked a side. So neither the partisan credibility conjecture nor informational efficiency is going to protect the floating voter from persuasion. But here's where things get a little bit complicated. Because remember what I've already told you about the floating voter. The whole reason a floating voter has not yet formed any strong attachments, positions, values, or ideas about government and politics is generally that he or she is not all that interested in government and politics. If they were, they might watch the news and then be persuaded to adopt one position or another. And so the issue with persuasion really boils down to this. It only works on floating voters, people who have not yet made up their minds because they're not interested in politics. But those people, because they're not interested in politics, don't generally choose to consume content by the news media. And so they're hard to reach and therefore hard to persuade. And now we can begin to talk about the qualities of a news story, this prominence, breadth, and intensity terminology that I introduced you to at the beginning of this lecture. Because our next learning objective asks for you to explain the circumstances in which persuasion can work. And on one level, I've already answered that question. Persuasion can work when the media is able to communicate with floating voters. But the media is only able to communicate with floating voters when they are covering a story which has a great degree of prominence, a wide breadth, and a high intensity. So here we're going to conclude our lecture by talking about what prominence, breadth, and intensity are, how they are imparted on a story by the media, and why they are relevant. Now, we'll go through each of these one by one, and we're going to start at the top of the slide with prominence. Prominence is the extent to which a story or event is treated as though it is important by the media. So a story is said to have a very high prominence if that story is treated as though it is very important. It is said to be very low in prominence when it is treated as though it's not important. Now, let's not get things confused. Just because something is treated as important doesn't mean it actually is. Just because something is treated as though it's not important doesn't mean that it's not. In other words, the media can, and sometimes does, make mountains out of molehills or molehills out of mountains. But by and large, we expect the media to cover big stories and to overlook trivial stories. And so just the fact that the media has decided to cover one story over another is going to suggest that the story they are covering is more important than the one they're not covering. And if they decide to talk about one topic for a very long time and another topic for a very small amount of time, that too is going to give the story that gets lots of coverage a greater degree of prominence, whether it should be treated as important or not. It is being treated as important, so it's prominent. And the story that gets very little coverage, a low degree of prominence. The media can also impart prominence upon a story by making decisions about how to talk about it or where to cover it. For example, if we're talking about a newspaper, one way that it might give a story a greater degree of prominence is by putting it on the first page as opposed to the second or the 32nd. Similarly, if we're talking about cable news, one way that a story might be treated as though it's more important is by receiving coverage during prime time as opposed to coverage at 2 a.m. Or if we're talking about an internet-based news source, putting a story first and foremost on the front page of your news site that everyone sees when they click over from Google is a way to say that it's important. But if you bury it through a sequence of links, well, now you're suggesting that it's not all that important. And it turns out that if you convince people that a particular story is very important by treating it as though it's important, which the media does, then floating voters are more likely to weigh in. Even if they don't usually pay attention, they might weigh in, they might listen to a particular story simply because you've convinced them that it's a matter of life or death. So consider the way that we talk about climate change, for example. And by the way, the terminology is climate change, not global warming. Global warming is a little outdated. Climate change. Now, I'm not going to weigh in on the political issue itself, but if the media has told you that as a consequence of climate change, New York and Florida are going to be underwater within 10 years unless we do something. Well, then you're probably going to think that's a really important story. You're probably going to think that global warming is the most important issue. So important that everything else is basically secondary. And therefore, you might just vote based purely on which candidate shares your views on climate change. But if, on the other hand, the media suggests that climate change is just a gradual, perhaps natural process of changing temperatures that might do some damage here or there to a particularly fragile ecosystem, but isn't an existential threat in any stretch of the imagination, well, then that story is not being treated as though it's all that important, and it's not as likely to catch your attention and get you paying attention. Again, shocking images that suggest that something is a matter of life or death, extinction or continued existence for the entire human race, it's more likely that you're going to pay attention. So another way to think about prominence is it's a way to hook the floating voter. When you treat a story as though it is literally a matter of life or death, then a floating voter who stumbles across the headline might be more likely to pay attention for just a moment, even if they don't usually care about politics. And if you want to see an example of this, at the end of this lecture, I'll scroll through some different headlines showing you how many media outlets covered the attempted assassination of then presidential candidate Donald J. Trump at Butler in Pennsylvania. And you're going to see that really what a lot of these media outlets were trying to do at the time is rob that headline of its prominence. Now, an attempted assassination of a presidential candidate, and indeed the leading presidential candidate, is obviously a very important story that's going to interest many, many different people and could potentially have huge consequences for our country. But if you are an anti-Trump reporter, and let's be frank, most of them probably are, then you don't necessarily want people to pay much attention to the guy. And so announcing that someone tried to assassinate him is probably not the most strategically sound approach to the news. And so instead of making this a really, really big and important story about an attempted assassination, you might try to find some ways to deflate the momentum of the moment. You might say, for example, Trump claims to have been shot in the ear instead of Trump was shot in the ear. You might, instead of announcing that there were gunshots at a Trump rally, say there were popping noises. Instead of saying that the dude was shot by an attempted assassin, you might say that he fell. Now, to be clear, he did fall. Right? There were popping noises, but again, what we're really fighting over here is whether we treat this as a deeply important story or we act as though it was a small and trivial event. We're battling over prominence. Okay, after prominence, we have breadth. Breadth refers to the extent to which a particular story, event, or topic is being covered by a large number of distinct news sources across different types of media or technological outlet. So, for example, a story has a very narrow breadth if it is only covered on an obscure internet blog. But if it is being covered not just on one internet blog, but many internet blogs, well, then it's got a little bit more of a wide breadth. Still pretty narrow, but wider than it was. But then if we are not only being covered by internet blogs, but we're being picked up on social media, and we're not only being covered on social media, which is still a part of the internet, but we're being broadcast on the radio, printed in newspapers, and broadcast on cable television, now we've got a very, very wide breadth. And as the breadth of a story increases, either because it's being covered by more outlets on one technological platform or more outlets across technological platforms, the size of the audience grows. If it's only covered by one obscure blog, the only people who are ever going to see that story and get to make a decision about whether it's important or not are the people who visit that blog's website, which probably isn't going to be a particularly large number of people. But if it's being covered by hundreds of blogs, it's on social media, it's on the cable news, it's on the newspaper's front page, it's on Twitter, so on and so forth, now all of a sudden, lots of people are going to stumble upon that story, whether they're looking for it or not. And if they stumble across that story while scrolling across Facebook, while driving, and it pops up on the radio, or channel surfing and it comes across their TV screen, then the media has a chance to catch their eye with flashing images or clickbait titles. And once the media has done that, signaling prominence, it can begin to get them to pay attention and therefore to exert persuasion. So breadth basically just works like this. When more outlets across more distinct technological types of media are covering a story, the audience exposed to information about that story grows. As the audience gets larger, the probability that there's at least one or two floating voters that stumble across the story inadvertently increases, and therefore persuasion becomes more likely. Of course, we also have to talk a little bit about intensity, and this is where we're going to conclude. Intensity refers to the overall amount or frequency of coverage that a story receives. So one thing to help distinguish intensity from breadth, even though they actually work in a very similar way as they relate to persuasion, is that a story can have a different amount of intensity on different media outlets. So, for example, Fox News spent way more time talking about the assassination than either CNN or MSNBC. Like CNN actually spent more time talking about that time Will Smith slapped Chris Rock than it did the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. That is not true on Fox News. Why not? Well, Fox News is friendlier towards Trump. It's a right-leaning media outlet. CNN is more hostile towards Trump. It's a left-leaning media outlet. And so again, when they're talking about issues or topics and stories that are going to favor Republicans, CNN is going to try to do so in as few words as possible. It's going to give it a low intensity, because the longer it talks about that story, the larger the audience for that story is going to be. If they only talk about it for 5 minutes, then the only way for a floating voter to stumble upon the story is for that person to happen to be channel surfing and stumble across the story within that 5-minute window. But if they are talking about it for 6 hours, then the window of opportunity for a floating voter to stumble upon it by accident will increase. Similarly, Fox is going to want to talk about this and show those flashing images as much as possible, because they want a wider opportunity for individuals who haven't decided how to vote to see what happened. Because they know that most of us don't like assassination attempts. And so if we see people trying to assassinate Donald Trump, that's actually going to make us more sympathetic towards his cause than we were prior to discovering the story. So they, again, want to cover it for as long as possible, as much as possible, as frequently as possible, giving it as much intensity as they possibly can to increase the window of opportunity for floating voters to stumble across the story, at which points they can again start signaling prominence, say, hey, this is really important, pay attention, hopefully hook them, and then begin to convince them they should vote for or against this particular candidate. And so that's it. That's our big story. But hey, stay tuned for just a moment. I'm going to scroll through some headlines that you might find interesting. Secret Service rushes Trump off stage after he falls at rally. Trump escorted away after loud noises at Pennsylvania rally. Secret Service rushes Trump off stage after popping noises heard at a Pennsylvania rally. Trump leaves rally after loud noises. Trump, who says he was shot in the ear, is rushed off stage to safety Saturday. Trump says he was shot in the ear during a Pennsylvania rally shooting. Trump says he was shot in the ear at rally. Trump taken away after loud noises at rally. Crowd cheers as Trump moved off stage. Now, in fairness, some of these headlines were published pretty quickly after the attempted assassination. And so a part of what might be happening here to explain why we're hearing things like popping noises and not gunshots, and Trump says he was shot and not Trump was shot, is pretty simple, and it's actually responsible journalism in a sense, right? Because what the media did not want to do is report that there had been an attempted assassination against Donald Trump, and then later find out that what they thought were gunshots were actually the sounds of someone's car rapidly backfiring. But on the other hand, do keep in mind, many of these reporters were there personally. Trump was visibly seen to be bleeding. People did actually die. And we knew that very, very quickly. And at least some of these headlines actually came out after this information about Trump having been shot and injured was already on the record and publicly stated, right? And we can see this from prominent journalists who, for example, on the day of the assassination attempt, within a couple of hours, were tweeting out that the Butler County District Attorney, Richard Goldinger, had already confirmed that, yes, indeed, the injury Trump sustained was gunfire. So a part of this is just responsible journalism. But a part of this is pretty straightforward. The media has an agenda, and it wants to set that agenda. Well, how does it set the agenda? How does it tell us what issues to pay attention to? Well, by signaling that some issues are more important than others. If they come out and they say, Donald Trump shot, that's going to be a pretty shocking little headline that's going to get lots of attention, and it's going to convince a lot of people to think that this is a big deal. And to be fair, it was. But if on the other hand they say Trump says he was shot in the air, it just sounds like Trump being Trump. If they say popping noises heard at a Pennsylvania rally where Donald Trump was speaking, that doesn't sound very important. Floating voters aren't likely to pay attention. And if you're an anti-Trump reporter, that's actually deeply important. Because if you turn on the television and see that someone's tried to kill Donald Trump and you're a floating voter, well, you probably don't like assassins, and so that's going to make you more sympathetic towards Trump and his cause or agenda than you might have been had you never learned about this. We can also see an example of framing crowd cheers as Trump moved off stage. Now, technically speaking, that's totally true. One thing you'll notice is that this story is actually published at 6:33 p.m. after the tweet from Merrill Cornfield. So clearly what we can see here is that the information about what happened to Donald Trump was already publicly stated and on the record. So we already had access to the information. We knew that the guy was shot. But how did Hannah Knowles and Isaac Arnstorff decide to cover this story? By saying crowds cheer as Trump moved off stage. Again, they're not outright lying. I want to be clear, outright lies are a very rare form of media influence or agenda pushing. But it is true that the crowds did cheer as Trump moved off stage, and yet what we're finding is that if that's all you read from this story, then you're going to think that people were happy Trump was leaving. Instead, what actually happened was that people were happy Trump was alive because someone tried to assassinate him. But by focusing on and emphasizing the cheers of the crowd as Trump left the stage, this headline places this story in a very different light.